Hey guys, welcome back to Results Junkies podcast. All of the pre-production stuff out of the way, and the hot mess of a morning is now behind us as Paul and I record. We're talking about Gemini. No, not the spaceship. The newest name for the newest AI bot. Bard has been renamed by Google to Gemini, and then we're going to pick up where we left off last week, where Paul was starting to... We were running out of time, man, and you were like really interested in talking about headcount reduction and what that means for licenses and seat shrinkage. So that's what's on our docket today as everything starts to slow down just a little bit. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I was just saying in the pre-show, I think like 2 of my 99 kids had a rough night, so I'm a little foggy today, but I don't know. Somebody else described me this morning as spicy, so we'll find out here in the next few minutes how that goes.
Was that somebody other than your wife?
How do you know me so well? Oh, man. But
I bet your wife.
I'm good. It's been a busy week. We're gearing up. When this episode drops, we will be in flight to Sioux Falls, actually.
That's true.
Which, by the way, Matt Paulson emailed me last night. I'm supposed to tell you that there will be donuts available. I'm going to reply back and just tell him.
Victory is mine.
I'm going to just reply back to Matt and just say, you've changed your tune and all you want is quiche in Sioux Falls.
If you ruin this donut thing for me, I will never forgive you. Never forgive you. And just because travel nerdism is in my blood, if my math is correct, on our way home from Sioux Falls after we've celebrated this great time with Matt and getting to meet the startups and get to be a part of their special day there, I will cross 900,000 miles of paid flights with United Airlines.
Wow.
On my way to 1 million, man.
So that, as you say, that just means they'll call you sir when they screw you later.
Pretty much. Yep. Pretty much. Yeah. As I said to somebody the other day, we prepaid for a very large chunk of travel, and then something got messed up with the renewal, and it took 38 days for them to reply to the email about me saying, "Hey, you guys kind of screwed up here." 38 days.
For the record, I think the only other time I've flown with you was when we flew to Paris together for, when we eloped, or when Dana and I eloped.
That's right. And I booked you guys in business class. We booked that like 3 days ahead of time.
Yeah, and then ironically, I think you've flown with Dana more often than you have with me.
Yep.
So this will be interesting. I'm curious what kind of seat. I will tell you, I'm actually kind of nervous about next week. I'm like, I don't want to be the weird seatmate.
You will be. There is no question about that. But inevitably, you'll get a picture of me taking my 30-minute power nap with my eye mask on and my headphones on, right after takeoff. So.
Okay. All right. So the thing is, I love your rituals because I still remember on that Paris trip, again, in the category of we are not the same. We were going to Paris. You were going to marry us. It was we were eloping, Dana and I, and nobody knew other than you and that sort of thing. And I still remember, like, when Dana and I get on a plane, even to this day, the first thing we do is we sit down, we order a drink, whether it's champagne or a bloody or something like that. So we get on there. Yep, champagne, please. This is going to be great. You disappeared for like 2 minutes and you came back out in your pajamas. Like our priorities were very different on that flight.
I'm not sure you had finished your first drink before I was sleeping on that flight. That's
true.
I mean, flight to Europe is, if you're lucky, it's 8 hours. If you're lucky, and usually they're more like 6 from the East Coast. So I don't love, in the list of rankings of things in my life, it's my wife and kids and then sleep. I mean, like that's literally the order. And so. Yeah, I want to get my sleep, and I remember, and I learned the hard way, by the way, because like you, when I was a youngin, like you, I used to drink more, and when my wife and we got married, and one of our first trips overseas went to London, and as you well know, London flights super short from the East Coast, and we were way back in the day, so we were connecting in Raleigh. American Airlines used to have a flight from Raleigh to London, I think to Gatwick. Anyway, we get on the plane, and we're having fun. And so back then, my favorite champagne, Perrier Jouet Fleur, was what they served in business class. And my dad had gotten us business class upgrades. And so my wife and I just, got in the plane and started drinking champagne. And, we were imbibing, fairly generously for, I don't know, 3.5 hours. And that was when we realized we were going to land in about 90 minutes. And we were very drunk. And so we napped for about 30 minutes. And then somehow managed to get from the airport to our hotel, still, somewhat inebriated, and at like 9:15 in the morning, begging the hotel to let us check in so we could sleep. So learn every lesson the hard way, man. Yeah, so let's real quick for folks who are tuning in, show@resultsjunkies.com is where you email us your questions, comments, concerns, and then he is at Paul Singh or at Results Junkies on all those social media places, and I am at Pizza in Motion. Yeah, let's talk the license thing. I want to start there. I mean, we'll hopefully we'll finish up with Gemini if we have time, but you were definitely interested in having more discussion about this, and to frame up the topic for folks who didn't listen last week, what we were talking about at the end was just with headcount going down at some very key companies, that has this ripple effect of, if SAP lays off 10,000 employees, or UPS is laying off, we talked about this, UPS laying off 12,000 workers, they're all white collar workers. Well, now they don't need Slack licenses for those people, or Microsoft Teams, or whatever other products they use. And so now those companies take a hit on their MRR and ARR.
Right. Yeah. And so, for context, we've been using this website called layoffs.fyi to track the numbers, which, again, I'll admit right up front, it's probably not comprehensive. It's only the stuff that's been announced. But as of the time we're recording this, it's showing something like 34,000 layoffs, and we're only 40 days into 2024. Right. So my point last week was that those layoffs presumably also are going to result in some sort of shrinkage in the products that those companies use. So in other words, and I'm making this up, but just for the example here, it's like if a certain company is using Slack and has 10,000 licenses for their employees, and then all of a sudden they lay off 1,000 of them, the net result for Slack as one of the vendors of that company is that the seat count goes from 10,000 to 9,000. And so really what I was trying to get to was this idea of what are the potential follow-on effects of this wave of layoffs, or this continued set of layoffs. I mean, we're at 250,000 last year, another 34,000 this year, seemingly no end in sight. So I'm curious.
And I would imagine too that the ripple effects are probably even more pronounced at the small business level, because as you get up into the enterprise level, my guess is that they're likely, and I don't know this to be sure, but they're likely more annual enterprise level contracts for these companies.
Yes.
And so we won't see the results on a monthly basis, if you will, even though the numbers will adjust. But with small business, it's like, I mean, do you use Slack in any of the stuff you do on a daily basis now?
No, we use Rocket Chat at Strata, although that reminds me, I need to, get back on Slack to join your community.
We are waiting. They are waiting, eagerly anticipating that.
I doubt that, but
yeah, it's fair. So we use it for work, and so we're not on an annual plan. We're just on a monthly plan, and so I toggle on and off as we add users and delete users. And so there's a very profound effect from a small business standpoint of what I would say. My guess would be that the MRR is probably pretty lumpy right now for a lot of these companies.
Yeah.
Monthly recurring revenue. Sorry, for folks that don't know that acronym. So we're an MRR customer for Slack. Maybe we have 10 users, 15 users, 20 users, whatever in our main company, RMR Capital. That could go up to 22. That could go down to 12. That's the flex in MRR.
Yeah, and that's a big swing for you, of course. Now, some of these companies that are laying off people, I don't know how to say this articulately, but some of these, like if you're a company that is in a position to where laying off 10% of your staff is, upwards of 500 or 1,000 people, chances are you're not paying for Slack or something like that monthly. Chances are you're on a quarterly invoicing system or probably an annual invoice system. So everything's going to net out. I mean, you're going to be made whole one way or the other, right? Slack's not just going to take your money, I hope. But the point is, though, is that when the renewal comes around, which it inevitably will, there will be a reduction. And so the point is, though, is that I think if I had to guess, and this is a total guess, I don't know anything you don't know, I guess, but if I had to guess, I think that there's probably at least a delay of 1 quarter and at most a delay of 1 year between, when we hear about a layoff and when the vendors of that company are affected. So it just makes you wonder, though, at some point, like, how far does this go? I just noticed, I wish I should have done my homework right before this call, but I think did Instagram announce layoffs too? I mean, I started to notice like non-SaaS kind of businesses starting to do layoffs now. I just actually saw, when I was scrolling through Facebook earlier this morning too, I saw something about like, you know, it was probably some clickbait article, but it said something like, if Tesla was to do any layoffs, what teams would they be from?
Right. Right.
So it's just interesting. There are going to be these ripple effects. I guess maybe that's the summary of why I find this topic so interesting is that, you know, when you look at the number of layoffs that have happened last year and already 40 days into this year, the numbers are pretty astounding. And everybody looks at that and says, wow, that's, incredible and alarming. But, I haven't yet heard a lot of people talking about what the ripple effects will be here, because inevitably there will be, some sort of effect downstream.
Yeah, and to your point, I did pull up a TechCrunch article, talked about Instagram cut 60 technical program manager positions, eliminating a layer of management at the company, which isn't surprising for companies that have gotten to some level of full growth, to think about reorganization. The interesting thing about this seat license creep, if you will, I mean, you have significantly more investing experience in SaaS than I do, but how many times did you look at a SaaS company that you were invested in, and they would send you their forecast, and the subscriber growth, instead of up and to the right, was down and to the right? Like that, it just doesn't happen.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to talk about that next. Yeah, I mean, like the only time I've ever seen, growth charts or growth forecasts turn negative was, the other side of the pandemic. So,
Right.
particularly with our DTC investments, when COVID hit, all of them spiked. Everybody started buying stuff online, and so boom, that
Right.
thing went up.
Right. Right.
And, over the last, I don't know, let's call it rolling 4 to 6 quarters, we've seen those projections and the actuals kind of regress back to the mean. So in other words,
Mhm.
if you were to like plot out what the growth across the DTC portfolio was supposed to look like, if you just do like a slope or a regression kind of slope on there,
Yeah.
COVID made everything kind of skyrocket. But now where we are is we're right back onto the line again. We're back to the curve on where everybody sort of projected the DTC industry to be, and we're talking in big generalities here, but generally we're right back to where we were supposed to be if COVID hadn't happened. I think we're going to see that on the B2B side here pretty soon. So you're right. Like, well, we won't name names here, but I sent you an investor update for one of the companies we're invested in last night. I think it was last night or the night before. And you can see like they too are like kind of their projections are still net positive. Now that
Right.
particular company is probably too small to have crazy big forecasts. But the point is though, is that I think we're going to start to see in the following quarters here, those forecasts kind of come back down. Now, if the COVID bump is any sort of hint, then, there was basically like 18 months of exuberance and then another 18 months of just a gradual kind of decrease,
Right.
as
Right.
the monthly reports came in and the forecasts came in. I think we're going to see that. So given where these layoffs started now about 15 months ago-ish, I bet we're going to start to see that. I bet if you and I pulled our B2B portfolio investor updates, looked at like their forecasts or maybe even the tone of their optimism in the emails and stuff like that, I suspect we're kind of at the peak of that. And I suspect that soon we're going to start to see that sort of exuberance kind of get tempered a little bit. But again, I want to also put a little asterisk on this. This is probably going to be most visible at more mature companies. So that's
Sure.
not to
Yeah.
say like a seed stage company is going to go doom and gloom, right? Because they're probably still so early on the curve, $500,000 in ARR, maybe $1 million in ARR. It's still all mostly upside for them. But for any company that's at 10, 20, 30, $40 million of B2B revenue, I think you're going to start to see, a little bit of cooling. You're going to start to see, net revenue retention numbers start to kind of decrease. You're going to just start to see these like leading indicators that are going to then pull the forecast down.
Yeah, and this is definitely a trend that we see in not just SaaS companies, but also in the broader tech market as sort of a result of this. A COVID bubble is probably still the best way to say it, but it's definitely become more of a COVID hill than a bubble, just based on, as you talked about, this residual effect. I think what's interesting, and I know we want to save some time to talk about Gemini, but and we don't need to go deeply into this, but there's a phenomenon here in the brick and mortar world, and specifically the restaurants that we're invested in. As you know, we own a chunk of Five Guys restaurants. Prior to COVID, we were very reluctant to adopt third party sales, DoorDash, Uber Eats, stuff like that, and and then we were just dipping our toe in the water, and then COVID happens, and it's like, great, jump in, like fire, 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 get everything in there, pound, 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 pound. And, we were at one point, we had a few restaurants that were over 50% third party sales.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yep. And now it's sort of like settled, and we're at the high end for Five Guys restaurants in the system. We're almost 40% of our business is through third party sales, DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, all that stuff. Wow. So here's the thing though, and I think you and I have talked about this on the show, but there's this like dirty little not well kept secret that still doesn't seem to be well dispersed, which is when you buy from Five Guys through DoorDash or Uber Eats, we're marking that price up because they're charging us a fee. And so we mark it up, not to talk in detail about what those companies charge us, but we're roughly marking that stuff up, call it plus or minus 20%. Now, when I look at my sales, I mean, it's, knock on effect here of that was 2020, it's now 2024. And if my sales are flat year over year now, they're just flat. But in reality, if I look back historically and say my sales are flat to 2020, I'm actually down 20%.
Right.
Because there's now this middleman in there. And I do think this will get competed down. Like, I think that ultimately what will end up happening is businesses will connect with driver networks in this environment. Instacart, Swiggy, all this stuff. Like, it'll become, I think, even more commoditized than it is today. But until that margin is competed down, the reality is that people are eating less frequently at a lot of these places. But it doesn't necessarily look that way if you look at, for public chains, like Five Guys is not a public chain, so it's not an issue. But if you were to look at Yum Brands, for example, Taco Bell and those guys, and they post flat revenue or even small revenue growth, that's actually a down number, which means less people are eating out because of that middle commission when they're upcharging. And so there's this, it's almost hidden from view that when you talk about consumer behavior, so tying this full loop back to, UPS lays off, however many thousands of workers, they're white collar workers, which means that they're more likely to have families. They're more likely to have kids, which means they're more likely to do takeout a few times a week because,
life happens.
Boy Scouts and cheerleading and track and all this other stuff. They lose their job. Their Slack license gets shut off at some point, but they also stop ordering food more often because now they need to save money. And so that's sort of hidden in this mix of how the economic behaviors are changing. And then the restaurant has to cut somewhere. And I think there's this belief that restaurants are a quote unquote brick and mortar business, but the reality is we have services too. I think we talked on the podcast at one point about how we're using an AI service to answer our phone calls now. We use a lot of other services as well. And when I think about those things, those are all small incremental MRR that we're cutting because our business is down, and there's this middle chunk that makes it look like the revenue picture is rosier than it really is.
Right. Yeah. And back on the tech tour, I used to, one of the keynotes I would talk about was, around the intersection of economic development and startups and all that stuff. And one of the conclusions I would kind of leave the audience with, particularly from an economic perspective, is that for better or for worse, whatever happens in the technology sector does tend to affect almost every other industry within that geography. Now, somebody listening to this is going to take that totally out of context, I'm sure. But the reality is that's the summary of what you just said there, is that when you let go of 40,000 tech workers within 40 days of the new year here in 2024, presumably those roles are not blue collar. They're particularly white collar. They're probably in the high 5 figures, maybe even 6 figures, low 6 figures, somewhere in there. So these are, whether they have families or not, the reality is that money is no longer available to them. They go into lockdown mode, at least until they find their next role. And that then affects not only these seat licenses at Slack or wherever else, but eventually They stopped going. They might have gone to Five Guys once a week. Now it's once a month, but only on birthdays.
Right.
And then it's going to show up in your books, or it's going to show up in your reports 30 days later, and that sort of thing. So that's the interesting part here is that, like all these people got hired during that zero interest environment during COVID when everything was like exuberant. And I get it. I mean, I'm not second guessing anybody back then.
Yeah.
But now the market's the employment market is sort of resetting itself to this new reality. And it's going to unfortunately trickle across to every other industry that services those people. Maybe they got their hair cut every week, and now all of a sudden it's every month,
Well, and you might have given an inadvertent example of one of the few businesses that really isn't tech enabled, haircuts. Like, I mean, everything now is a technology business in some way, shape, or form. And the effects might be different, as you say, but there is this ripple effect, and it may be harder to see in some places than others.
Well, it's interesting. This is going to be totally anecdotal, but I've been going to the same barber here in Ashburn for, I don't know, more than a decade, maybe more, maybe 20 years now. Anyway, 2 weeks ago when I was there, he's like, "Oh, hey, Paul, it's 22 now instead of 20, right?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Usually every other Friday I take me and the boys to go do it, right? So anyway, he sheepishly said, "Oh, it's 22 now." And I was like, "Oh, Thomas, that's cool, man. What's up?" Because I also know his business. So I know how long his lease is. He's got like a 10-year lease in his spot. So it's not like he was in a lease renewal year. Right. I also know he hasn't hired anybody else. Like he's got 4 people, 5 people there. Like nothing had really changed. And so I paid him. I was like, that's okay. And so I was like, hey, out of curiosity, why now? Like, why not last month or like when, last quarter or like when you leased this place 2 or 3 years ago? He said, customer numbers are down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the exact thing he said is like people that used to see me every other week are now coming every 3 weeks.
Right.
And, when that happens, and so he showed me his numbers real quick. And sure enough, he's running this thing on paper, right? So it's not like I can go into a CRM and truly track how many people are in there.
Sure.
But when you look at his QuickBooks account, you can see it. Like it's anyway. So just really fascinating.
I make the joke with my barber. I've had the same barber for a very long time too. And I make the joke with my barber because I'm always bad about going. And now that we're on video podcast, you'll be able to see how bad I get at going as it gets long and unwieldy. I've always made the joke with him. He really should have a subscription model. And he should just charge me, whatever, $50 a month. And if I come twice a month or if I come once a month, like I'm his customer and that's his model. And he's like, well, like why would customers ever do that? It's like, well, they do it because that's the model that you offer. So like the subscription model is, $50 a month or an individual haircut is $100. And he's like, well, that would be horrible. I'm like, yeah, but it's what every other business is doing to customers. So after they get over the initial outrage, they'll sign up for the subscription service.
Well, you know what it is like, this is interesting. Look, I love that we're talking about this too, by the way, because, here in Ashburn, you live in Loudoun County like I do too. So you've probably seen that flagship car wash that's everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, they bought out the local guy that
they bought them all. I mean, somebody should find that guy. I would love to see a case study on how he did that because it's just fascinating how quick and overwhelming the entire takeover was for a bunch of seemingly independent locations.
And the survey, and by the way, and the service levels tanked. Like
fell
off.
The only good one is the one at One Loudoun. Everything else is kind of like amateur hour. So, for example, we have a subscription. We pay the subscription there. I think it's for our Suburban, for the 3 rows, I think it's like $70 a month or something like that. And really the economics of it is that if you go in twice, well, when you got kids, you got to clean that thing out pretty often, right? So, if we go twice a month, it would have been cheaper to do the subscription. So that's what we do. But now because it's so close to the kids' school, we just drop off the kids. And then once a week, we just drive through there. They vacuum it out, wash it out. So it all works out for us. I'm surprised that other places don't do this, like barbers, like even Five Guys, like what's the club? So anyway, that might be a whole different episode. And I'm sure people will argue like, oh, well, we don't need more subscriptions. Sure, you and I probably don't, but there are probably, like, for example, I'm making this up, but if we were to look at the demographic, like if I were to sit there and, at one of your Five Guys locations, if I were to sit there like day in and day out for 30 days, I suspect that I would notice very quickly that 10 to 20% of your customers are probably responsible for 40 to 50% of your revenue.
It's true. We've been digging into that data. Yeah.
And those people are the subscription customers probably.
Yeah. Well, or the loyalty customers, like
or the loyalty customers.
I think there's two ways. I think there's two ways to skin that cat. Let's try talking Gemini for a few minutes because, as I said in pre-show,
this is crazy. This topic, man, my cynical side's gonna come out. Set it up, man. Set it up because now we're gonna get spicy.
Yeah, and shockingly enough, we're gonna get spicy about something that we both agree on, which never happens. And I would say by this point, not knowing what the cold open was when we started recording, I would say there's a very high degree of likelihood that Jeremiah used those comments in the cold open. But so folks will know it as Bard. It was Google's answer to ChatGPT, and they've renamed it Gemini. And they've also come out with a pricing model. Yeah, Gemini. Think about it: spaceship exploring the world.
Oh, God.
It's fractional GPT. So it's an extra $10 a month on your Google One account. And like I don't actually have a Google One account because I have a Google Workspace account. A lot of that stuff comes with it. So I'll be interested to see if this bleeds over into that. But essentially that $10 buys you two things. It buys you access to the Gemini prompt right now with a more accurate base of information. And they've been very vague about what that means. So there's a free version of Gemini. The paid version has quote unquote better prompts. So like you got this year's model. And then the potentially intriguing piece is that in theory, in the future, this will include an integration into things like Gmail and the Google Workspace suite of apps, if you will. And I don't want to steal your thunder, so I'm gonna let you go first.
I think this is the dumbest thing in the world. The idea of putting a $10 paywall on this is the dumbest thing in the world. Now, let me maybe try to be productive and constructive here. I use Superhuman as my email client. Do you use that?
I used it for a while, but if you remember, we had this conversation. We believe that we are diametrically opposed humans because I can't stand conversation.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. The way that threads the messages.
Yes, and you think I'm an alien with a third eyeball because I don't use conversation style.
I had no idea that message threading was like that was the hill you're going to die on. But
it is. I literally died on that hill.
You should probably talk to your therapist about that. But so I pay $30 a month for it. Arguably that could be too much, but it's fast. I like it. I'm used to it. The hotkeys, like I can just crush email with it. They have this one feature that they released as part of this the product maybe 3-4 months ago that when it came out, I rolled my eyes. But now I use it every day. The feature is that right at the top, when you open a message thread or when you open a message or whatever, right at the top, just under the subject line in a smaller font, it actually uses AI to summarize the entire email into one sentence. And which on its own is probably, people are like, oh, you need that? Like, come on. But, it's not interesting until you really get to a message thread that has 17 back and forths and you're like, What are we talking about again? And it summarizes the whole thing. Like, Ed's excited to go to Lubbock, but needs to know where the donut places are. Like it'll summarize it and it'll tell me what I need to do next, which is so nice. Now, part one, it's included in the subscription. They didn't come to me and say, hey man, you were paying $30 a month and now it's $40. They didn't do that. Right. And number two, I don't have to think about using AI. So to me, I think this is the problem, not just with like Gemini, but in general with all the talk about AI. I think there's two common problems for me. Number one, everybody's positioning it as something I have to do something with. Like, I don't want to do more. Right.
Right.
And then number two, everybody's positioning it with a paywall. Now somebody listening to this is going to be like, yeah, but Paul, OpenAI is making $1 billion a year already on these things. I get it. But I don't think that's going to last forever.
No, I don't either. Yeah, I don't either.
Pricing pressure is downwards at all points. Like eventually this stuff's going to be free. Now, it may not be another year. All right, let me say one other thing and I'll be quiet. I suspect the smart people at these large companies are putting these paywalls on these things because the spreadsheets don't lie. If you look at, for example, the public reports coming out of Microsoft, for example, I believe the infrastructure spend for 2024 is $100 billion or something like that. I'm sorry, $100 million, I believe, in infrastructure spend, in terms of like new GPUs to be able to support these things. Now I might have my numbers off a little bit, but that number, those large numbers, it's not unique to Microsoft. Every large company that's moving towards AI is having large, massive capital expenditures this year which we can see in the NVIDIA reports, right? NVIDIA's hardware unit is making so much money hand over fist right now.
Yeah, it really is.
Right. So the point is, though, is that if you look past all my cynicism and all that, I get the business reason for why they're putting these $10 paywalls on things, because somewhere that capital expenditure needs to be, covered. But God, I'm just not there yet. Like, there's not enough value for me to like pay another $10 on this. Especially, by the way, I just got an email. I probably should have looked this up before the call. My Results Junkies email is on a Google Workspace. I set that account up I feel like 15 years ago. I've never looked back at it. I don't even know how many accounts we have on it. But anyway, the point is, though, is that I got an email a couple days ago that said, oh, your pricing is increasing as of February 1st. Now, I looked the other way because I'm like, I don't even know what we spend on it, but it's necessary. Like,
right.
I can't, where am I going to move my email? Like, I don't want to go, so it's necessary. But now somebody comes to me and says, or Google comes to me and says, hey, activate Gemini for Results Junkies and another $10 per month per seat. I don't want to do that. Like, what?
Right. And I think conversely, I think the mistake that I think Google made here is they've done so good at creating this ecosystem. And I mean, maybe they think that this is finally the lever to pull to get enough incremental revenue from all the people that are in their ecosystem. I don't actually think this should have been where they pulled it, but I think it would have been much better for them to say something like, so like if there's a chart out there with Google and it's like they've got their different Google One bundles, and then there's a fourth bundle now that's an extra $10 a month. My opinion, along the lines of what you said about Superhuman, is this should just have been included in the largest bundle. And if you didn't need sure, there's a la carte pricing. If you're not a Google One user or you're not a Google Workspace user and you're an Apple guy, sure, you can pay $10 a month for Gemini. But if you're already paying us money in one of these tiers, hey, your price went up, and by the way, now it includes more stuff. Like that to me is the way that you make sustainable money off of B2C customers with AI. Otherwise, it's just not a B2C fit, in my opinion.
I think, okay, I know we got to wrap here in a second, but let me just kind of maybe put on my conspiracy hat theory here for just a moment. So here's the thing. It's obvious that all the big players are moving towards more usage of AI, more usage of LLMs and all that stuff, right?
Right.
But to do that requires not only significant R&D, but it also requires a significant set of infrastructure updates, and all that. And all those things take time. Like, allocating people to R&D takes time.
Right.
Those people need time to find stuff. Then hardware needs to be installed, tested, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that these paywalls are partly designed to, help offset the initial capital expenditure. Sure. But I actually think the additional piece of the decision that was made to put these things out there is coming from the PR side of the businesses. For example, like Apple's been talking about, Siri updates recently. Well, truthfully, we all kind of know implicitly that Apple and these big companies are working on big projects that can take years before you and I ever see them, in an Apple iOS update.
Yeah.
But, by saying it early, is there a PR advantage? Is there, is it, I don't know. I don't know how to articulate this other than to say that let's bring it back to Gemini for a second. If we didn't have to think about PR, we didn't have to think about, capital expenditures and all that, then really there's no point in talking about what this upcoming Gemini thing is until it actually is really close to the launch. Okay. So now let's bring those other concerns back into play. Well, you do have to buy the hardware, and all that. So maybe putting that $10 paywall on there helps offset it. But on the flip side of that paywall, it also kind of keeps the tire kickers away. But now you've also added in the PR layer. People are talking about it. Hey, there is this feature coming. So long and short is that I think that in the long term, all these things that have a paywall, like the ChatGPT $20 account and the Gemini $10 account and all these things, I would bet within the next 3 years, all of them become free.
Oh, I would. Yeah.
Because that's how you're going to get the mass, consumer adoption and stuff like that. But I think these paywalls exist right now just to get a little bit of cost offset and to keep the tire kickers away. and allow these companies to actually talk about all the innovation that's happening, so they're not getting left behind during the hype cycle. So maybe that's too much of a conspiracy theory, but we are where we are.
I love your tin hats. And I know you got to go. Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to talk more about Gemini and the world of AI in the future. I think we could do a whole other show on this.
I love it, man. I love it. Well, enjoy your additional emergency trip to Disney. You and I call emergencies very different things. But I will be living vicariously through your Instagram account.
Do it. Yep, we'll be hitting hard. And you know what? I'll see you in Sioux Falls.
No, I will see you at Dulles Airport on the way to Sioux Falls.
Man, I gotta fly with you. God, what was I thinking?
Well, it'll be fun. We'll have to maybe live tweet it or something like that.
There you go. All right, man.
All right, buddy. Safe travels.